Hey everyone, this is Paul from Thinking Christian, and today in this video I'm going to talk about atheist and naturalist morality and special pleading. And really what I want to do is understand how it's possible that atheists and naturalists can accept moral realism without special pleading. So I'm genuinely confused here, and I do want to understand. So this video is not meant to be condescending. I'm not even really trying to convince people anything about God or morality. I just want to explain why I'm confused, and hopefully, if there are atheists and naturalists watching this video, and if so, thank you, let me know in the comments what your answers are, because I have not gotten any satisfactory answers about this, and part of the difficulty is I know people who I would consider to be rational, intelligent people who are atheists or naturalists and who are moral realists. I just do not understand why, and I haven't really gotten a satisfactory reason. So what we're going to do is we'll go ahead and get started. I'm going to talk about a few possible explanations and why I think they fail, why they do fail. And to the naturalist or atheist who denies the truth or the possible truth of religious or supernatural claims, but holds on to moral realism or the objectivity of moral claims, the main question is why and how is this possible? And would you understand, here would be the first question, before you even try to give a response, do you understand why to a theist like myself, it looks like special pleading? It looks like we're saying, well, we don't believe in God because either there's not enough evidence or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, for these reasons. But we do believe that there are such things as objective moral claims outside of our minds, without, in a similar way under the naturalist or atheistic, the standard sort of narrative that I hear, we don't have good reasons to believe they exist or believe reasons how we could know them to be true, which is, of course, J.L. Mackie's argument from queerness. So basically the thing, okay, we don't believe in God because of evidence X or lack of evidence Y, but we do believe in moral realism. Obviously, it can't be because of the same X and Y. It needs to be something different. So the question is, what are those differences? And that's what I want to understand here. Because, right, if the same reasons that cause someone to reject belief in God constitute the exact same reasons for rejecting belief in moral realism, if these would be the same reasons, then atheists and naturalists are being inconsistent in their belief structure if they are holding on to moral realism for the reasons that they reject for belief in God. So that if that is the case, then they either need to give up moral realism or they need to accept God with the same level of epistemic warrant that they confer to moral realism for those reasons. And right, let me also say, it's not the theistic philosophers who've convinced me of this, actually. When I was a skeptic, I was a moral nihilist. And part of this was finding the work of naturalists like Jonathan Haidt, Sharon Street, Richard Joyce, J.L. Mackie, Michael Ruse. These are people who've talking quite a bit about these evolutionary debunking arguments for not just religious belief, but also our belief in moral truths or anything being moral. And I found this very compelling because I had a naturalistic bent. Now, these arguments are only compelling if naturalism is true. And once again, you should read these people if you haven't read them, because I think they make some very good points and very important points. But I found their work to be compelling. I'm curious what the answers are, and if you guys are watching it, let me know. So let's look at a few of the reasons that fail. The first question we're going to ask here is, how can there be a moral ontology and moral epistemology under naturalism? And the next thing to notice is just how convenient is it that it matches the morality that we traditionally and historically have grounded on religious grounds. One thing that we often hear is, well, there seems to be general consensus about things that are right and wrong across different cultures. But that also means there's general consensus about the existence of supernatural as well. And we'll talk about consensus as well in a minute. So we need to know what exactly is different about moral claims and how they can be separated from the historical and religious grounds that traditionally were used to justify them. I'm not saying it's impossible, but we need to see this. And of course, the naturalist who believes there's, quote, not enough evidence to warrant belief in God, which, could be close to a self-defeating type of foundationalism, but let's just go ahead and put this aside. We can't say we need evidence for everything we believe, because then we'd need evidence for that statement and it becomes, you have the regress problem. But let's put that aside and ask them, okay, if you're believing that you would need evidence to believe in God, what is the type of evidence that has convinced you that moral realism is true? And let's compare that to the evidence you don't see for God and see whether they're the same or not. And the question we get to ask is, of course, is this evidence consistent with a naturalist or atheistic epistemology, with the epistemology they developed under naturalism or atheism? So the first thing I want to talk about is consensus. This is probably the most common argument I hear from atheists or naturalists justifying their moral realism. And they basically say that, look, pretty much everyone believes that murdering babies for fun is wrong. And I will grant this, but does that necessarily make it true? The problem is this doesn't help the naturalist or atheist, because religious belief, and in particular monotheism, is also a consensus view. So this can't be the thing that separates theistic belief from moral realism belief, because this also works. Now, what the atheist or the naturalist may claim is that that religious claims are contradictory. But at the same time, a lot of moral claims are contradictory too, but not necessarily all of them. So this needs to be much more precise. In other words, consensus is not the determining factor here. There needs to be more going on. And one can, of course, say naturalism is even more of a minority view than moral realism. So if consensus is evidence for moral realism, this should be stronger evidence against naturalism. In fact, yeah, you can say that religions make contradictory claims. That's fair. But the naturalist is making a very, very, very strong claim against supernaturalism. They're basically saying all of the possible religions out there that people believe are false. It's not, whereas I think most religious people, they don't necessarily have to say that all religions are false per se. In fact, even, for instance, the Catholic Church, they have their whole statement about, we recognize all that is holy and good in other religions. They just think their version is perhaps more right, and I think that's okay. Similarly, we may disagree with people in other cultures. We may think our view that slavery is wrong is more right than people who thought slavery was okay, but still had other views about morality as well. So the fact that there's disagreement isn't going to be enough here because, once again, religion and supernatural things are also kind of a consensus view. And even if they were no longer a consensus view, that's still not necessarily going to be a compelling argument per se. And of course, as I've argued here on the channel, consensus is not an epistemology and doesn't have a clear link to epistemology. So this reason would fail a priori. But even if we were to grant that particular part, that consensus could be an epistemology, notice here how it does not help the naturalist come to moral realism. The next reason I often hear is really just an appeal to personal experience. I hear atheists or naturalists often just say, well, I know some things are right or wrong, or it's obvious that murdering babies for fun is wrong. Now, this type of reasoning isn't necessarily wrong. For instance, if I was to go to the doctor's office and they poke me with the shot and I'm like, ow, and they're like, how do you know you're in pain? That'd be a ridiculous question to ask. It's like, I know because I directly experience it. But notice here what the naturalist or atheist is doing. They're appealing to a sort of moral faculty that is inborn in people, and as a result, these sorts of truths we come to know directly. The question is, how is this possible? And to the naturalist or atheist who rejects this type of obvious or a priori knowledge that people could have about God, we need to know how this is any different, or I'd like to know how this is particularly different. You'll often hear theists say, I just know God exists, or I just know Jesus loves me. I don't necessarily need to offer an argument or any sort of proof. I just know it, in my heart or whatever. And this seems to be the same exact argument that atheists or naturalists are putting forward when they're saying, I just know that some things are right or wrong, or it's just obvious to me that murdering babies for fun is wrong. And the skeptic who rejects this but offers the same argument for morality, right? They say you can't know God exists because God doesn't exist, but you can know moral truths because moral truth exists, is basically special pleading and being inconsistent. There has to be something different here that makes belief in God different than belief in morality. And the next thing I'd say, it's certainly not obvious that some things are right and wrong for some philosophers and moral philosophers. And we'll talk about how we can resolve this problem in the next page. But the fact that there are many experts who disagree about this should at least give us pause to think how it's possible that this thing could be true, or that some people don't find such arguments compelling. And don't get me wrong here, I do think this is a good argument. It's just where it's not a good argument is when you basically say, oh, I accept some types of obvious or a priori knowledge and not other, and I'm not going to give you a reason why I'm differentiating them between the two. I think it's fair to say, hey, look, we just have this inborn moral faculty that just knows certain things are right or wrong. That doesn't mean that it always needs to be right. It just means that it's right some of the time. Once again, this only becomes a bad argument when it's used in a way where we don't understand the reason, or at least bad argument in the sense that I just don't understand what the difference is, and that's what I'd like to know. And one of the things here, you can't use this argument necessarily about saying, well, we know morals exist and we know God doesn't exist, because this is once again arguing in a circle and begging the question in favor of the existence of these things. We need to know how it's possible that these personal experience pieces are possible in one case, and that's how we come to know them, but not possible in another. And I don't think we come to these moral judgments per se on the basis of arguments. Often they're very emotional or intuitive appeal. It doesn't necessarily make them false. It just means if it is true, it has to be true, not necessarily only on the basis of argumentation, because we don't always reason our way to our moral claims. And the last thing that we often see, and this is kind of an extension of the last part, but it's partially different, is an appeal to teleology. Someone who thinks murdering babies for fun, that's okay, is just messed up. Now, this is actually, true. I would argue this is a true statement. But this is an appeal. Notice this is an appeal to teleology. It's an appeal to the proper functioning of one's moral faculties. Somebody who thinks something morally wrong, their moral faculties are diluted, or they're mistaken, or their moral faculties are just functioning wrong in some particular way. And we think, psychopaths or sociopaths, they're missing an important piece. Their moral intuition is not functioning correctly. But the same argument also exists against naturalism and atheism. And in particular, what Alvin Plantinga argues is the Calvin or Aquinas model of a sensus divinitatis, that people have some sort of, I guess, God type of faculty built in. God designed it this way. And when it's functioning properly, we come to know that God exists, I don't know, by reading the Bible or by participating in volunteering. I don't know. There could be a lot of different things. But the point is that the argument is such a faculty exists for theism as well. And this argument about the proper functioning of moral faculty and the proper functioning of theistic faculty are similar types of arguments. So as a theist, we would like to know, how is it possible someone can have a functioning moral faculty, but without presupposing that, or how can you know that a moral faculty exists and a theistic faculty does not exist? And, what Plantinga and other people are going to argue is it's the atheist or naturalist whose cognitive functioning is malfunctioning. Their cognitive faculties are malfunctioning, which causes them not to know God exists or to know God personally either. And I want to say here, this is not a pejorative type of argument. And the atheist who believes belief in God is a delusion is appealing to a similar argument. But notice what this does. This says you can't argue that belief in God is irrational unless you're able to show that God does not exist. Because if God does exist, then plausibly he would provide a way for people to do this. Now, I think this, combined with the personal experience argument, gets into some interesting territory, because the naturalist may say, well, I have personal experience with my moral faculties, which causes me to believe that morals exist, but because I don't have personal experience knowing God, I don't believe God exists. But because they would argue that somebody who's a psychopath or a sociopath who doesn't believe morals exist, that's them functioning improperly, not necessarily evidence that morality doesn't exist, would need to give an additional argument why it's not just their own personal experience, that there's something else going on here. So once again, appealing to proper functioning of faculties needs to be differentiated so that us theists don't see this as special pleading either. And likewise, this teleological piece goes into Hume's is-ought distinction. How can there be any sort of proper functioning under naturalism? Not just theistically, obviously, but also proper functioning moral naturalism. And how can naturalism get around Hume's is-ought distinction, right? If there were some things we truly ought to do, how could we know this with science? To most of us theists, this looks like a category error, right? Discovering, okay, we can know everything through the scientific method, as most naturalists or atheists are going to claim. How can we figure out what we ought to do as opposed to what is? And how is this compatible with the naturalist epistemology, given that, we generally find everything through science? So that's kind of the next question. And when it comes to moral realism, one of the things the person arguing for moral realism needs to justify is both an ontological and an epistemic piece. They need to argue that moral facts can exist, that moral truth just exists, period. That's the ontological piece. And then the epistemic piece is we need to know how to find it. And the example I always give is a compass, right? For a compass to work, magnetic fields need to exist, and the compass needs to have a magnet on it to be able to track the actual magnetic field as well. You need to be able to solve both of these. And of course, if both of these depend on a theistic type of God, then it would be incoherent to try to argue for one without the other. Although, of course, I'm not going to argue that here because that would be begging the question. But anyway, that's just a possible response. But the naturalists and atheists have the additional burden of ensuring the reasons that they offer for the ontological and epistemic problems of moral realism, which I would argue any moral realist should at least have some reasonable justification for these, because someone who's not a moral realist is going to ask them. But the naturalists and atheists who provide answers to these need to make sure that their answers to these don't allow them to continue disbelieving in God. And I think that's the thing that's difficult for me to understand. So thanks for watching. And if you've watched this video, I'm curious what you think. How is it possible we can just know things that are morally true or good, and these are objective facts, but somehow know this and still say that God does not exist? That's the part I don't understand, and I'd like to hear answers. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.